Welcome to HLS in the community. Thank you so much for coming by first thing on a Friday morning. I'm Michael Stein, Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability, whose website is up on the boards behind you, recently completely revamped by the fabulous Juliet Bowler, who's sitting up here on the right. And we're very happy to have you at this session of Enabling Disability Rights Throughout the World. Before we begin, I pass on to you regrets and warm regards from co-founder and chair of HPOD, Professor Bill Alford. Professor Alford is in class, and it's a tribute to what a popular and wonderful teacher he is, that he can teach on Friday morning and fill a room with eager and devoted students. But he passes on his regrets and warm regards, and hopefully we can all see each other during the course of the reunion weekend. Today we're going to have three speakers, and I'll introduce them, and then each one of us will have about 10 minutes to talk about enabling disability rights, and then hopefully we'll have a dialogue back and forth. I hope you've brought questions and suggestions and all kinds of critiques so that we can engage each other in a discussion. So to my left, to your right, is Dr. Fengming Cui, who is the head of our China program at HPOD. Dr. Cui holds a Ed.D. from BU and is a specialist in special education, inclusion of people with disabilities, and is gone a good part of the year in China working on the ground with communities both in cities and in rural areas. To Dr. Cui's left, again to your right, Alonzo Emery, who lectures here at the law school and is split between HPOD and between East Asian legal studies. Alonzo is a 2010 graduate of the law school, one of our more prominent and impressive ones. He has taught at Renmin University in China, and he uses his skills in negotiation to bridge some of our programs and to work with communities locally and in China. And to Alonzo's left, again to your right, we have Ms. Haben Girma, who's a 2013 graduate of the law school, our very first and to date only graduate who happens to be deaf-blind. Between Helen Keller and Haben, it was 100-something years. And we're extraordinarily proud of the work that Haben does. She works in awareness raising and disability advocacy ever since graduation, and she will show you as part of her presentation a nice video as well. So welcome, one and all. We're very pleased to have you. The Harvard Law School Project on Disability was founded by Professor Alford and myself in the year 2004, so it's been 14 years. I guess we have a
15
celebration coming up. It came about through an introduction by Martha Minow, my civil procedure professor, first teacher I had at law school. She said, you two should talk to each other, and I was up here on fellowship and grants and doing work at the Human Rights Program. It also came about as part of Professor Alford's work with Special Olympics, on which he's been on the board for ages and ages, and my work at that time helping to negotiate the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the first global human rights treaty related to people with disabilities. Since then, in 2004, we have worked in over 40 countries. Personally, I've worked on the ground in over 40 of these countries, implementing, advising, working on various aspects of disability rights law. It is a wide range of activities. It ranges from very high-level things such as critiquing constitutions, helping to draft laws. So, for example, I worked for 3 years on Vietnam's national disability law. This year I reviewed Bhutan's draft national law, working with ministries around the world to try to get their governments to work coherently and cohesively together on implementing disability laws and policies, working with national human rights institutions ranging from the Asia Pacific to South Africa to Bangladesh to Israel and others, doing research. We conduct lots and lots of research. Selfishly, I will announce that among the 130-plus articles and several books that I've written, the big commentary on the CRPD will come out from Oxford Press in September, all 800,000 words of it. You can get in line and pre-order if you so desire. Litigation, which makes up a very small part of our docket, but which often has high profile. So the landmark European Court of Human Rights case on Kish versus Hungary, which enabled people with intellectual disabilities to have the right to vote, was one that we forwarded and supported. The Mexican Supreme Court case on Robles, which has to do with autism and guardianship, and we can go down the list on other sorts of litigation. But most of all, our work has to do with civil society. Most of all, our work has to do with working with the stakeholders, the people with disabilities around the world, who, because of this treaty, and have now claiming their rights. And it's not just outside the world, it's also right here in the United States. So if we were to characterize and put it into groups, which is often difficult given the range of work that we do, we work with groups of persons with intellectual disabilities to help them claim their rights, and that includes working with individuals here in Massachusetts, the New York State Advocates, the only group of self-advocates with intellectual disabilities in Israel, the only group in Bangladesh, and so on. Working with parent groups and support groups, individuals of families, because it's often the families who have the privilege and the challenge of working and forwarding the rights of their children and family members with disabilities. So recently we had a visit from Africa Tikkun, which is a network that we work with of over 1,000 single mothers who have disabled children in South Africa. They're in 4 townships around Joburg and 1 around Cape Town. We also work with other sorts of self-advocacy groups. We work very hard on inclusive education. That tends to be one of our watermarks. And it's great privilege. It's both challenging and an opportunity to work, and as much as we can, as much as the students are willing to be involved, we work with our wonderful students. So about 5 weeks ago, 2 of them got up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, and we all went out to Marlborough and worked with the Massachusetts Advocates Standing Strong. We had over 100 self-advocates in the room. It's part of a long-term process of bringing to the Massachusetts legislature their ideas about guardianship and having more control over their lives and their decision-making. And we're hoping to bring a bill to the legislature with them in January. Others of our students have interned in various places, ranging from the Disability Law Center, and we'll wave to Rosie in the back, who just did that this semester, to others who are working over the summers, to Janie this year, who is over at the ACLU in Tennessee. And pretty much we have friends all over the world, and it's wonderful to be able to support and to place our students in these organizations, mostly disability rights oriented, but sometimes just human rights oriented, and to enable them to have those opportunities. And the law school is always extremely generous about supporting good projects. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, and one that I'm glad we've all been doing together. The one phrase that I always repeat in all of these talks is that I feel extremely, extremely lucky in that I get to work with people I love, for people I love, on projects that I love. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful way to spend your day. You never feel like you've gotten enough done, but you always feel somewhat pleased with yourself at the end of the day. So let me turn over to Dr. Swain to perhaps describe in a little more detail some of our work in China.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Stein. Thank you all for coming to this event. So whenever I talk about our work in China, I get very excited and probably emotional at some point, because our work in China has been having a long history of more than 1 decade, and so it's a very complex and complicated and challenging but rewarding experience for all of us who are involved in our China work. So today, so I'm going to share 2 main parts. The first part is the highlights of our work in China, and the second part is the students' involvement in our work in China and over here related to China. So there are 3 parts in our work in China. The first part is we have a long history of awareness raising and attitude change trainings in China. We use CRPD, Professor Stein just talked about, as a very appropriate and effective tool for those trainings, because China played a very positive example in ratifying a UN convention at a very early time among the states that ratified the UN convention. So we are working in a context in which disability has been reviewed mainly from a medical perspective, and it's seen as an abnormal state, condition of individual. Raising awareness and changing attitude is the ground for all the other works in China, and we've been providing CRPD trainings on different topics in many different locations in China. When Alonzo was teaching in China, we both traveled day and night to different locations, and this is the way we arrange our trainings. We probably have a training on Saturday in one city, and so on Sunday in a different location. So when we finish our training on Saturday, and we go rush to the airport, and I had a little bit food at the airport, then flew into a different city and got ready for the training on the next day. And so talking about the understanding of disability and disability rights in China and the context, I think I'm going to share an example to help us to understand what that means to people with disabilities. And one of the disability organization leaders we work with, he himself has a physical disability, vision impairments. And when he got married, his wife also has vision impairments. When they were getting ready to have a child, and the doctor they visited, so started a conversation like this: "Oh, so your life is like a tragedy. Why do you want to have a child that get introduced into this tragic life you already have?" So that was the first point the doctor had, and then they said, they are both very strong disability rights trainers. They said, I don't think our life is tragic. We think our life is very meaningful. We contribute to many wonderful works to promote inclusion for people with disabilities. We use our experience to help people to understand why inclusion is important, not only for people with disabilities, but for society in general. And the doctor continued to say, it's more likely that you will have a child with vision impairments. Why do you want to have a child like that? So this is like a typical conversation, and I would say the majority of the public would agree with. So this is like the reality we face, and so through all the trainings in the past more than 10 years, and it's still a daunting, challenging, but like rewarding experience. This is one part of it. It carries through all the components of our project. The second part I want to highlight is our teaching with our partner law schools in China on disability rights courses. And it started when Alonzo, again, was a professor, assistant professor over there. And so it's been several years, and now the course is open to both disability law clinic students and undergraduate students in China, because at law schools in China, they do have undergraduate programs, unlike here. So the undergraduate course was started from 2017. So from 2015, I've been teaching the disability law clinic course with another SJD graduate from Harvard Law School. Right now is a professor at the law school I'm teaching, and I'm also teaching the course for the undergraduate students. And so I'm going to talk more about students' involvement in and beyond the courses later, so I'll stop here for this point. The third part is our engagement with disability communities and parent support networks. So for the disability community, and this is really the heart of our project. It's integrated in all our disability work components. And so I set a little bit for the awareness-raising trainings because not only we provide trainings, we also explore and find out local leaders who can be trainers in their communities and also localize our trainings in their communities to continue to raise awareness. So that is one part. I'm going to also say a lot more about our work for disability communities when I mention our students' involvement. So I'll pause over here to emphasize our work for Parent Support Network and attitude change. Parents, as part of the society, and their attitude towards disability and their children with disabilities are shaped by the environment a lot. And as parent organizations grew faster and faster and stronger with a lot of resources to support their work for their children, and we realized that it's very important to help parents to understand not to overprotect, to control, to represent their children with disabilities, but support their children to develop according to their own interest. Or to help parents' organizations to define and carry out projects for the best interest of people with disabilities. And that has been a very important work. It's not easy, but we are making great progress. We also prepared parent leaders who can be trainers in their own communities, and we take them to different training sessions for them to share across the areas and to learn from each other for peer support. And that's part of our Parent Support Network. So we have a long history of supporting parents in China. It's been more than 10 years. And so this is a great part of the work. And you can never learn enough from the work you have with parents. So our engagement with students, students are meaningfully engaged in all parts of our work. And so there are two things. We have students' engagement both in China and over here at Harvard Law School, and there's a linkage between these two law schools in terms of students' engagement. There's also a continuity of students' work between those two law schools, and I will explain why. So students are involved in all our trainings in China as volunteers, as participants, and also we support students' work on policy analysis, policy drafting, and so to help them to understand, to have a very evidence-based policy analysis, we support their engagement with persons with disabilities and their organizations and parent networks. So this is a very important component in China because in the past 10 years, since China began to implement CRPD in China, a lot of progress has been made. And now the critical part of the work is to make the work beneficial to people with disabilities, to promote social inclusion, to make it a win-win situation for both people with disabilities and without disabilities. But given the long-term medical perspective of disability and its influence, and the progress has been slow, but it's going on. And so we involve our students in all our work, and we introduce them to do pro bono work with disability organizations off campus. We also invite disability representatives into the roundtable discussions for policy analysis, policy research, and also students' research for the disability clinic class. And we always require them to do an independent class project for that class. And the second part is that some of the students, when they finished their study at the law school in China, they came here. And they still continue their work, and after they finish their education at Harvard Law School, and some of them directly jump into disability work. Some of them became lawyers back in China, but still actively involved in our disability work. And also, as I mentioned, the SJD graduate from Harvard Law School, he became a leading professor on CSR and disability inclusion in China. He's been teaching the course with me, and he's been promoting disability employment, accessibility, and related policy development. And he's been working also actively as an advisor for disability organizations in China we have been working with. And moving forward, if I want to highlight one of the areas we want to do more, I would say the engagement of students and teachers from law schools with disability communities and parent organizations in China for more evidence-based policy research and pro bono work and practice of students, and also prepare more younger generations from law schools. And no matter where they go after they graduate, they have a very positive awareness of disability rights. They can contribute to inclusion of society. And so I'm very grateful for all the support we receive, and we hope that we're capable of doing more in China with more law schools, with more partners in China, because we keep getting endless invitations for collaboration. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. And before we turn over to Alonzo, because you're always so modest, I'll just interject a little bit of a human face on it, which is, having gone out and done the trainings with Dr. Swain and our local partners, it's an amazing process to see parents who have been hiding their children, keeping them at home, not engaging in the community, or even parents like some of the migrants who are talking about giving up their children, or even, and then they meet Dr. Cui, who has a doctorate and is a PRC-born national and has had a wonderfully successful life and is doing all this amazing work and changing people's perceptions and their day-to-day lives. And it's almost like the sunshine comes out and their perspectives after the day of training changes, and they begin to think, my kids have a chance, my kids have a place. And they go from viewing their children as tragedies and burdens to viewing them as blessings and children with potential. And that's just a wonderful, wonderful thing that you and our partners, including Alonzo, do. And I wish I could take you there with us to see it. So thank you for that.
To follow what Professor Stein just said, it brought me to our engagement in Alonzo's class for disability law in China. And so we were involved in his teaching, both Professor Stein and myself and a few other HPOD associates when we were in China. And so we were invited to his class. We got the opportunity to engage with students, and so sometimes we use our personal stories to review and what changes have been made and what challenges still existing, and to make people understand more about the context, also remain hopeful and never give up. So this is a very beautiful part of my work and our work in China. Yeah.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Morning.
Good. So it's a real honor to be on this panel today and to get to share a little bit of the work I and my colleagues and students have done related to disability. I'm lucky I get to see Professor Stein and Dr. Cui and Juliet and Melissa and others almost daily. But it's a rare treat to be on a panel and get to see my friend Haben here. You'll notice in all our remarks there may be a China theme or connection, because actually Haben and I didn't meet at HLS. We met in Beijing many years ago, and haven't seen her since Beijing. Haben was invited by our then dean of the law school at Renmin University to come as a consultant and to meet with students and faculty and administrators and many others in Beijing, and to share her wisdom and experience. Then she was in her final year of law school, but was already very much a star teacher. So it's a real honor to see her again today. Because there are a number of students and certainly former students in the room today, I thought I would use my few minutes to talk about the ways in which students have been involved in our work. Just a bit on my personal background. My background is in negotiation and conflict resolution, and I also spent almost 10 years of my life living in China, so that explains my connection to the China work and also to East Asia more broadly. Dr. Cui already talked about the many linkages between HLS and China and disability work, and I'll just highlight a couple of examples of the ways in which students have been involved. So when I was teaching in Beijing, we had the opportunity to bring over faculty and students from HLS to lead a negotiation workshop for members of disabled persons organizations from all over China. So for me, it was really remarkable to see HLS students share their knowledge of interest-based negotiation, and then also to facilitate a conversation with these DPO members to hear about some of the challenges they face in their work. And what was also a great way for students to get involved, they drafted a full curriculum that included negotiation simulations. These were fact-based simulations based on many interviews with DPOs in China, and they reflected some of the challenges that come up pretty often. And I think negotiation simulations are a great tool to get into conversations and to get at the heart of issues. They're also a great tool for promoting empathy and understanding. So often when we use the negotiation simulations, we'll have people switch roles. So a parent of a student with a disability might assume the role of a teacher or a school administrator to try to understand where that person's coming from, what their world view is. And I just think greater empathy and understanding is what we really need in the world, and that's just one tool that HLS students and faculty have created to try to build that in the China context. So I was teaching in China for 3 years, and then I returned to teach here at HLS, and I knew one thing for sure, that I wanted to continue my work with Dr. Swain and Professor Stein, and Professor Alford is not here. As Dr. Cui mentioned, we were involved for many years, day and night, doing traveling all over China. It was a lifelong student of China, it was a great opportunity for me and the students that came with us to just go to different parts of China and understand what folks are facing in their disability-related work. Well, when I came back here, I was first working with the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and within my first year, we had the opportunity to launch another project in China. This time it was a consensus-building effort. So students and myself, we spent several months interviewing stakeholders who are involved in the education of students with disabilities at various different levels. And all of these stakeholders came from a particular city in China, and of course they were all working on disability-related issues. And what we discovered is that they very rarely had opportunities to talk with one another. Chinese cities are large. So the first city I lived in China was considered small. It had 5 million residents. So So they weren't able to get together and talk and share ideas. What we also discovered is that there were a variety of different opinions and points of view on what best practice was as it related to the education of students. So some individuals thought that an inclusive setting was the best for everyone, and others felt that it was more appropriate to have special schools because they were more tailored to the individual. And so after many months of conducting interviews, both from here and then locally in China, the students launched a 2-day engagement. It was a consensus-building effort. It brought these folks together who hadn't had an opportunity to necessarily meet with one another and to first share their views and interests, and then spend the rest of the time really digging in and developing concrete plans for future collaboration. And I think, one of the best or byproducts, and Professor Stein spoke to this a moment earlier, one of the best byproducts of a lot of our engagements in China, in the US, or elsewhere, is that it allows us to bring, it's the convening power of HPOD. It allows us to bring people together, to share ideas, and in some cases they launch concrete projects on their own. I know at least in one instance, the connections that were made at the engagement I spoke about led to a student getting enrolled in school for the very first time. And so I think that's something that HPOD and certainly students here who've worked on that project can be proud of. For me, in my role as an educator, it's been really gratifying to see how students from the US and students from China can work collaboratively together to create a lot of value. It's also been great to see how you can take students who in some cases haven't really thought about disability or inclusion a lot, and then by the end of the semester they're quite fluent in the issues and they've thought really deeply about disability and inclusion, and that's always great to see. Another way that HLS students get involved in our work is, of course, in the classroom setting itself. So Professor Stein teaches wonderful courses here and at the Kennedy School, and has almost always included a unit on China in his courses. Dr. Swain and I have had the opportunity to visit David Hoffman's class. He has a pretty innovative course that he runs on diversity and dispute resolution, and we've led sessions related to China there. And then several years ago, Professor Alford and I launched a course that I'm always excited about that connects students in Beijing to students in Cambridge via video. And each week we discuss a hot topic in the US-China relationship that has some sort of legal dimension. And every year we've included a unit, or at least a couple days, or a day or two on disability. And each and every year we've had Dr. Cui join us and guide us in that session, which has been tremendous. Now, we all know that not all our students will necessarily contribute 100% of their professional life to disability-related issues. But what I have found is that they start to think more deeply about, again, disability and inclusion. And when they leave our projects or when they leave our class, they're going to continue asking questions, really important questions about whether or not the organizations they're involved with or in or running, whether or not they're inclusive. Are they providing the proper accommodation so that everyone can participate? And I think that is a really powerful gift of the work that we try to do together. Finally, I'll say, as a continuing and lifelong student of negotiation myself, I've constantly learned deep lessons from my engagement with individuals with disabilities and their allies. I think disability writ large is often an overlooked area of public discourse and public dialogue. So I'm thankful that the school today has provided this platform for all of us, that Professor Stein has convened this session, and that in a moment we'll have an opportunity to hear from all of you, get your questions, also for you to share your insights. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, and thank you all very much.
Thank you. And just to emphasize one of your points, which I think was they're all terrific, but one in particular, although we speak about things through a lens of disability, much of the dynamics that we teach about inclusion, we also encourage the students we teach, the people we work with, to fill in their own blanks. So when we talk about disability and inclusion, maybe think about race or gender or sexuality or nationality, because the same dynamics of seeing the godliness, beauty in other people, seeing the equality, reaching out, embracing others that we talk about in disability applies equally across other boards. And when our students, although we'd love all of them to go and do disability rights, go out into the world, you're exactly right. Whether they become CEOs or partners in firms or judges or whatever, we hope that somewhere in the back of their minds they think about this sort of inclusion. And in the feedback we've had over 14 years, that seems to be the case. So hopefully we're having a nice ripple effect. Haben, we're so happy to have you back and to see you again. I get privileged to see you every now and then, but welcome back. We're so excited, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to be back here with great colleagues. This is my first time seeing Alonzo in the United States. So this is really exciting for me, and also to be back here at HLS after 5 years. My name is Haben Girma, and I'm deafblind. I'm using technology to help me access information. I'm holding up a Braille display. It's a Braille computer with dots on the bottom. And I run my fingers over the dots to feel the letters. We have interpreters in the front who are typing on a wireless QWERTY keyboard that's connected to Braille, and they're providing visual and audio descriptions. So if people smile, if people laugh, if people fall asleep, they give me that information. So they're watching you. When people meet me, the first thing they usually ask is, how do you communicate? The second thing they usually ask is, have you heard of Helen Keller? Yes, actually. Helen Keller was an amazing advocate. She lived from 1880 to 1968. She advocated for women's rights, disability rights, racial equality. She spent her whole life advocating. Disability is not the barrier. The largest obstacle is often social attitudes, social expectations. In China, in the United States, in Ethiopia, the biggest barrier is social. When Helen Keller was looking for a college to attend, Harvard wouldn't admit her, because back then, Harvard only valued men. Helen's disability didn't hold her back. Her gender didn't hold her back. It was the community at Harvard that was practicing exclusion. We've come a long way since that time. Harvard eventually made the smart decision to open its doors to women, people of color, and people with disabilities. I'm the first deaf-blind person to attend Harvard Law School, not because I'm the smartest or most hardworking, but because there have been a lot of barriers throughout our history that prevent people with disabilities from gaining full access and having full participation. There's this myth that successful people with disabilities are superheroes or have superpowers. That's not the case. When people gain access, it's because communities choose to be inclusive and choose to remove those barriers. And there are many different areas in which we can remove barriers, from social, having flexible policies, understanding that all lives are worth living, to digital, making sure digital services are accessible. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area where there's a lot of tech innovation, and I specifically focus on the area of tech and making sure when people develop websites, apps, and other digital services that they're accessible. The vast majority of websites and apps have access barriers, and that's not fair. Oftentimes, it's illegal. And when I graduated from HLS, I leaped into a Skadden Fellowship where I worked on increasing access to digital information. And I did that by suing people. And it was exciting and rewarding to create change through litigation. Litigation is incredibly powerful. Education is also powerful. And after a few years, I switched to focusing on teaching. A lot of people build websites and apps. They'll post videos on social media and not realize that they're not making it accessible. So I want to fill in the space and teach people about accessibility. If they don't listen, well, I know a lot of good lawyers who will use litigation to make sure things become accessible. So there's lots of ways to make change. Education is a great one, and then litigation. Lawyers, community lawyers often work in collaboration, addressing lots of different areas. When I say digital accessibility, there are many elements to that. Blind individuals access computers through screen readers. Screen readers are software applications that convert graphical information to speech or digital braille. Digital braille, like the device I'm holding on the table here, there are about 100 different kinds of these braille computers, smaller ones, bigger ones, made by different companies. And if someone designs their website and app to be accessible, then people who are blind, who use these devices or rely on listening, can access that same information. There are free guidelines online to teach people how to do this. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for websites, and Android and Apple have accessibility guidelines for mobile apps. I'm going to share a short video that allows you to see and hear what accessibility looks like. Ready?
I'm pressing play, but it's not playing.
No, it's not.
Oh, gosh. Tell Mom about it.
A screen reader is a program that converts graphical information to speech or digital braille. The screen reader on the iPhone is called VoiceOver. VoiceOver also works on the Mac, iPad, and the Apple Watch. So when I'm using my phone, I use VoiceOver. VoiceOver can speak out loud and send information to the digital braille display.
News. Checking for news. National Geographic. Unread. World's largest rodents on lamb from Toronto Zoo.
I'm panning right on the braille display using the advanced forward button. If I wanted to instead use hand gestures on the iPhone, I could flick right with one finger. To open an item, I can double tap anywhere on the screen.
Text size. Caption. Title. Title. World's large. Title. After escaping from the High Park Zoo in Canada, 2 capybaras have eluded capture by Jason Biddle. Published June 9. Most people do their best to avoid rodents of unusual size. But after a pair of capybaras escaped from Toronto's High Park Zoo on May alert. Gordon. Hi, I'm at the door. Sushi. Pot of food. Fish cake with swirl design.
My friend's at the door, so I'm just gonna let him know.
Close. Button. Reply. Button. Messages notification. Hang. In. There. I'm. Almost. Done. with this demo. Send button.
VoiceOver has allowed me to access more information, news, mail, and messages. And it's also a way for me to know when friends are at the door. Thanks for watching. Bye. So that's an example of a screen reader. And that's on iOS. There are also screen readers for Android, for Windows, lots of different kinds. And if someone designs their app website to be accessible, then you gain access to a larger user base. There are 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the world. That's a significant market. So you gain a larger audience, access to more people when you design it to be accessible. That app is the standard news app. It's not a special app. Separate is rarely equal. I'm not a fan of building separate websites or separate apps for people with disabilities. We need to have one app that is accessible for everyone. Same thing with schools, with organizations. We should strive for everything to be accessible rather than having separate things, because separate is rarely equal. There's a lot more to digital accessibility. You can read up on it online, or you can ask me questions during the Q&A or afterwards. I'm going to be at HLS all day. But when you build websites and apps, when you post photos to social media or post videos to social media, make sure it's accessible. You want to be able to include everyone. And we're all creators. We're all posting and sharing information online. So this is something everyone can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haben. And again, we're all thrilled that you're here. And just to be personal, it's always a special thrill when one of your students comes back and you know the terrific work they've been doing out in the world. And we're all so proud of you. So we have time for dialogue. Do we have questions, suggestions, critiques that we'd like to engage on? Please.
Kathy Flaherty, class of 94. I am the executive director of Connecticut Legal Rights Project, so we represent low-income people with mental health conditions. But we are in the process of redesigning our website, finally. And I have made sure to ask for accessibility to be part of the design. But I'm just kind of wondering in general, what kind of things make a website more accessible versus less accessible, and any suggestions you have. Certainly I'll be following up with you later about possibly students working with us.
Wonderful. Haben, would you like to take that initially, and then I could contribute some things as well?
So there are different elements to accessibility. There is captioning for videos. Captions are the text that provide access to the audio content on videos. So if there are videos on the website, make sure they have captions. If there are images on the website, from photos to figures and graphs, include image descriptions, text descriptions of what's on the photo or figure. And then if you could share with your team to look into the web content accessibility guidelines and review those and have the web developers design in compliance with the web content accessibility guidelines. There are also accessibility experts who can consult and help make sure that it's accessible.
Thank you. And the guidelines are very clear and very easy to access. And Judy Brewer, who's just down the road, is the empress goddess of web accessibility. But part of it is also culture when engaging with web designers and other artists. So Juliet just redid our entire website, but we remember very clearly going back when we put our website up the first time in about 2006. And it was my wife who designed the website and interviewed the designers and laid it all out. And we interviewed people. And we had local, from Cambridge, Silicon Valley, right? The Cambridge people came in and we said, here are the things that we need. And they said, no, that's not possible. Now, you never tell my wife something's not possible. But in addition, she's a scientist by training. She does her research. And she said, well, what do you mean it's not possible? Here's what Human Rights Watch did in this case. And here's what Mayusa did in this case. It's also part of the culture. So we wound up with a web designer who was an ex-hippie from Berkeley who believes absolutely in inclusion. And she had been working on single-page websites. But this was her challenge to actually do the first full-blown large type of website. And we not only made it accessible according to the WAG guidelines, but we also thought about persons with intellectual disabilities. So we wanted to be very, very sure to have plain language, spacing between things, not have things move around. It's not only a matter of technical compliance, but it's also a matter just of culture. And there are lots and lots of good people now who do that as well. And again, Juliet did a great job, so thank you. And yes, we're talking later about collaborations. Yes, please.
Do you have a list of good websites that people can look at so they can see a good accessible site, or are prizes given out for any of these things?
What a great question. Haben, do you have any favorites you want to share?
My website's pretty good. So, a lot of the disability organizations recognize and give out awards to celebrate different different tech services, from apps to websites that are accessible. The American Foundation for the Blind each year gives out a Helen Keller Achievement Award. And often they recognize tech companies that do great work to make their services accessible. A lot of the native apps on Apple's, a lot of native apps on Apple products are accessible. The website on Apple is accessible and has many great videos featuring people with disabilities from different kinds of disabilities, from using switch control. If someone has a limited mobility, maybe they don't use a standard mouse or a standard keyboard, they can use switch control to navigate their computer or iPad, whatever they use. So lots of different disability groups. Here in the Boston area, there's the Perkins School for the Blind and the Carroll Center. So I often encourage people to connect with the disability organization that is nearest to them and in their area.
And it's not only about websites, it's also, I shouldn't do this, but Jonathan Lazar and I had a book that came out a few months ago on information technology and disability. It goes to areas such as gaming, which people often don't think about. And why would you consider the average gamer to be a person with a disability? Just like years ago, they wondered, why would you consider the average gamer to be a woman? Now it turns out more women do it than men. But the range of things beyond websites is just immense as well. Dr. Swain, you had a few areas you wanted to go back to about trainings and our work.
Yes.
Would you like a few extra minutes?
Yeah, so when Haben talked about women's rights, and so we do have our project emphasize women with disabilities and their rights a lot. So we, in all our trainings, and we require a larger percentage of participation and representation of women with disabilities. And as we see more leaders in disability organizations, but we don't see many women. There are more men with disabilities became disability leaders in the country. So when we identified this need, and we intentionally promote women's rights and also invite more women with disabilities to come to our training. That is one part. Another part I want to emphasize is the inclusive education part. Over the past several years, policies on inclusive education have been developed very fast, but parents are struggling with sending their children to regular classrooms. Some are successful when they negotiate with schools to accept their children with disabilities. Some are not successful. Not successful because parents stopped pursuing, and they were convinced by the school administrators and teachers that regular classrooms are actually not a good place for those children with disabilities, and they instead they should send their children to special schools. That is a better place for their children. This is a strong voice, and some parents were convinced by those voices and withdraw their children from regular classrooms and eventually send their children to special schools. And that has been a very typical example shared in our trainings. And so our training help parents to understand where those voices are grounded. Why some parents continue to pursue inclusive education for their children, but why some stopped, and what are the hidden issues behind those decisions, and help parents to understand how to make good decisions for their children. And one of the examples shared by a parent in our training, Alonzo and I did back in January this year. Not only we provide feedback, a very good thing happening in the classroom is that many people with disabilities, they speak up. Many parents and many students and learn from the sharings and engagement between different parts from the community, and that has been a beautiful part. And also, to help people to understand why disability is not a medical issue, but a social state. Sometimes I use my own example, and when I finished high school, I was not allowed to go to college. Back then, there was no strong support from the policy for me to pursue higher education. So, but that didn't stop me. So I went through a self-learning program, and to finish the program and get the substitute degree that allows me to get into a master's degree when policy became stronger to support me to go there. And so I use this example to help my students and participants of our trainings to understand. I said if at the moment I was not allowed to go to college, if I took it as my fate and stopped there, and you would not see me over here as a teacher. Because many students we teach at the law school in China, probably every time when I ask them, only 10% of the students had regular engagement with people with disabilities in their lives, either on campus or in their communities, or within the families, only 10%. For example, if we had 40 students in my class, probably less than 4 would have that. That means segregation is a huge issue. People with disabilities are invisible. So I challenge my question to think from my experience. If I stopped there, didn't move on, didn't find another way out, you would not see me over here. Do you see this example like as a social problem or a problem directly related to the medical aspect of my disability? So those are the things that has been very effective in helping students to raise their awareness, and they felt they had a different understanding of the policies they have been reading and working on. That's another part I want to emphasize. And also, in our class, we have guests with disabilities, like blind lawyers, to come and share. And one of the blind lawyers, there was only a couple probably in the country. One of the blind lawyers I invited to speak in my class regularly, and he had an experience in pursuing a job in the college after he finished his law school. He wanted to be a teacher, actually. That was more of his interest for his career. And he didn't tell, in one of his job applications, he didn't tell he had a vision impairments. So he got the chance to have this interview, and when the university leader came to interview him and saw him, his blindness, and he was so shocked, he said, He prepared, so the blind lawyer prepared many questions to show his qualification for this job, but none of the questions during the interview was related to his skills and knowledge. So the first question was, if students use cell phones in your classroom, can you see them? Can you stop them from doing so? He said, well, no, I cannot see my students using cell phones in my classroom. So then you can't be a good teacher then. You're not qualified. He said, well, to attract students' interest in listening to your teaching is always important. You don't force your students to listen to you. You always want to make your teaching useful to the students, so students stop using cell phone. That would be my strategy. But that didn't, give him the job, and so later he became a lawyer, and he sued an airline. He represented two people with physical disabilities, very severe physical disabilities, who got denied by an airline to use their service to fly from one city to the other. And so when he showed up at the court, the judges were also surprised by his vision impairments and, if you have a vision impairments, how do you read the cases? How do you prepare for being a representative lawyer for this case? Things like this happen a lot. I think I would share these cases to help you to understand some very meaningful components in our work that's ongoing, that's everywhere. We use those components for capacity building of students and disability organizations and parents. So awareness raising, why we do this, like for the past 10 years. And these are the main reasons why. It's never ending. It's a very daunting and critical task for us.
Right, and
Thank
to
you.
pick up on your remarks, the same issues that we see in China, we see in many other countries. They're often universal. So when speaking about children with disabilities going to school, we hear the same excuses, rationales, and we could put different languages, colors, religions to what we hear, which is it wouldn't be fair to your child. We don't have the training to include your child. It wouldn't be fair to the other children. We have personally nothing against it, but the parents of the other children have been resisting it. And of course, it's something that you have heard in real life. I have heard in real life. I was kept out of school as well. And it doesn't seem to go away. But on the flip side of it, the working with parent groups, you described China, we also did work with the parent groups in the Philippines. We began with 16 families, and it's now a network of 600 families, and it's parents whose kids were not in school but who advocated and learned how to get their kids in school And then we trained them to become social workers, more or less, caseworkers, to go and to reach out to other parents and say, you know, I know what you're going through. I've been there. Here's how we're going to do this together. And the last time we did a sweep, we managed to get 600 children into school just in the Manila area. So the problems are often universal, the solutions are often universal, except for they all have to be tailored to particular cultural context. But I'd like to move to Alonzo for a moment because some of the work that we've done generally in HPOD has been to use disability as a human variation, as a universal phenomenon to create linkages and connections. So, you know, I did 8 years of track 2 diplomacy between Iranian and U.S. disability groups. I've done Israeli-Palestinian groups. Once they get together and discuss it, the problems are common, the human issues and nature and obstacles are common. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the work in negotiation and the work in bringing together groups based upon this common human trait.
Yeah, well, I can maybe point back to the consensus building effort I was talking about earlier. So that was an experience where people from the same locality, again, were on vastly different sides of the spectrum when it came to inclusion and education. And what you do, and I think in those cases, is exactly what you alluded to. You looked for the unifying thread. So certainly, all the people who came to the table, they were interested in securing the best possible education for as many students as possible. You also have to consider the interests of the stakeholders. So part of the folks in the discussion were individuals who worked either at special education universities, so normal schools that are training teachers to go into the special education system. And they, understandably, you have to address people's concerns. They understandably had some concerns about a movement towards purely inclusive settings. What happens to my graduates from the normal university when they want to find a job? Are they going to be able to find a job? And part of some of the solutions they were brainstorming and thinking about is, well, actually there remains a really strong role for folks who have a background in special education in the mainstream educational system, because there's experience working with student communities that teachers in other schools don't have, and they can lend that expertise certainly to those teachers. So there's ways, there's no secret to the sauce, but it's often, or there's no secret sauce, but there's often, it's through unpacking what people's concerns are and what their interests are that you're able to come up with some kind of shared understanding and some solutions that will work for the various parties at the table. But I wanted to just go back to something that Dr. Cui mentioned around awareness raising. I think that has throughout been a key element in the work that we've done, and really starting at the simplest level of the kind of language we use is helpful. So, if we're in Chinese, the terminology related to disability, there's a spectrum there from the highly offensive to the less offensive, and certainly that's true in English as well, if we can reflect on some of the words we deploy that are commonly used by individuals. So that we often start with language as the foundational piece before moving on to other issues. And then, just as a final note for the students in the room who might be considering continuing either working with us at HPOD, I would certainly encourage you to do so. One of the things I found that I wasn't fully prepared for, I knew that the work we do would be physically exhausting because we're going all over, traveling quite a bit. I knew for me it would be mentally exhausting because I often have to work in my second language, in Mandarin, which is hard for me. It's my second language. But one of the things I wasn't as prepared for was sort of the emotional piece of the work. So I think, and we as a team have been good about tending to that amongst each other, but certainly every engagement that we're involved in, every project we're involved in, we discover there's about 1,000 other things that we could or should be working on, and so it often can seem daunting. And certainly when you're up in front of the room, folks look to you for answers, and that can also be a difficult space to occupy. And so, I would sort of turn it back to all of you and see what sort of answers you can, or solutions you might be able to bring to the table, or advice you have for us. But that was just a note I wanted to flag for students who are considering the work that we do.
Thank you. And Haben, would you like to share a few thoughts on how to get to consensus and to awareness raising regarding accessibility? Either some of your tricks or some of your observations on how you raise awareness and then have companies and others turn the corner on thinking about inclusion as the norm rather than something from the specialty shelf.
I think it's really, really helpful to start out with communication and language, as Alonzo was mentioning. There's a lot of fear of being offensive, so people are afraid of asking questions like, do you say disabled? Do you say special needs, differently abled? There's a lot of fear about how to even start. So for me, I don't judge people by the words they use, but by their compassion, by their intent. So if someone uses a word that some communities might find offensive, I'm listening for what they actually mean to say, and then I can help teach and educate them on what they meant to say. For me personally, I like the word disability. It's tied to civil rights, Americans with Disabilities Act. So that feels powerful. I know there's a phrase, see the person, not the disability. But disability is a part of my life. I don't want people to ignore my disability. I want people to acknowledge it. So I like the word disability and I embrace it. But I also make space for people who have different opinions, who prefer to identify as special needs or differently abled or another term. I grew up within, my parents speak English as a third language. They're from Eritrea and Ethiopia. So I've had to navigate many different cultural spaces. So I'm used to encouraging people to cross these cultural differences. So what I find most helpful is to open up conversation, help people realize the values from their point of view. For many companies, their top value is money, making money. So I will frame the issue of disability access in terms of making money so that they'll get interested. And that often works.
Okay, so once more to the floor. Do we have questions, critiques? Yes, please.
Good morning. My name is Attila. I am an LLM student from 2013, so this is our 5th year reunion. And once I got back to Brazil, during my law school year, I did work with constitutional law, so nothing regarding to disability. But when I went back to Brazil, I did my second master's degree, and there I studied autism and law in Brazil. And yesterday I was speaking with Gabriela, who is a colleague of mine, and she's a social worker in Brazil. And we were talking about the difficulties of reaching people with autism once they're adults and they have no families who take care of them. And I was wondering, how is your experience in China especially? How the institutions work with people who are already adults and they don't have families and they have mental disabilities? So how is your perception of that?
Okay, thank you for your question. In China, so families are main caregivers of people with disabilities. So if a person has a disability, especially severe disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and those who are regarded as having challenges in having independent life, and also when they are facing segregated communities without facilities and services for independent living. So families and those people can become like a huge burden to their own families and parents. There are many, like tragedies happen in those situations. So that's why the parent groups we work with, given how challenging it is, they tend to do policy advocacy on like programs, social benefits programs, and for people with disabilities when they grow older. As far as that is a very important part of policy making, but that has also, in this certain context, also has another negative impact as well, because it's related to like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, like Chapter 8, about awareness raising, because the awareness of people with disabilities, their capabilities, their participation in community has been very ignored. If the focus is on getting social benefits for people with disabilities and to have them taken care of, so children with disabilities might lose, especially those who have severe disabilities, might lose opportunities to gain education, to learn independent living skills. So there's like a very fine line between those things. So when we do our work in China, when we help parents who have adults, children with disabilities, to pursue social benefits for their children, we also have to remind parents with disabilities to be aware of the abilities of children. They might have different ways to contribute. They might have different abilities, and it's always important to try from the beginning rather than just assuming that taking care of them in a charity system or other systems, similar systems, is always the best solution for them. So I'm not sure if that's helpful for your question.
And
I mean,
again,
oh.
I'm sorry, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I think your question speaks to something we've been thinking about internally. We've done many years focused on Article 24 and education of Article 24 of CRPD and education. And there's been a lot of progress in China and elsewhere on students with disabilities gaining access to quality education. And then we realized, well, what are you getting all this education for? It's to get a job or do something after you're done with school. Certainly that when I was in school for many years, my parents had that question. They said, what kind of job are you going to get? That's why we're sending you to school. So I think, so we've redoubled our efforts, and I think Dr. Cui spoke earlier, could probably talk more about the corporate social responsibility initiatives, which have included awareness raising for corporations around the talent, skills, and abilities of future employees with disabilities, and to encourage hiring of individuals with disabilities. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's definitely a piece that needs to expand in China and worldwide. And you were going to say,
sorry, no.
Professor Stein.
And unfortunately, it's a common phenomenon. So here in the U.S., those of us who work in policy refer to it as the cliff. So for people who are on the spectrum, have intellectual disabilities, have other cognitive disabilities, they get support through here, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and a series of state benefits through the age of 21 or 22. And then at that point, it's the cliff. It's, that's it. Off they go, like lemmings off the cliff, and they either fly or not, and most of the time they don't. And to try to get back onto the state support is enormously difficult, and the support goes dramatically just downhill once you pass that tipping point of 21 or 22. And so it's, even in countries that are developed and supportive in general, it's an issue with people when they reach that age. Others? Okay, so before we wrap up and let you go on your way, Juliet, an advert for those who wish to join the HPOD email list.
It's right on the HPOD website, which is conveniently located behind all of you. So
We would love
Mailing
to
list.
hear from you. We would love for you to hear from us. We're happy to interact with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to each member of the panel. Please join me in thanking the panel members. And I hope you have a rewarding, connecting, and enjoyable reunion weekend.
Thanks.